for being here, and welcome to the first Government Affairs Forum, not only of this year, but of the last 2 years, featuring Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Chamber. It's wonderful to be back in person. After 2 years without this having virtual government affairs forums, it was really good to see people networking and talking, something I know that we've all missed, but I was really pleased this morning when the suit still fit when I put it on. So I'm happy about that. I'm off to a good day. Virtual events certainly offered a vehicle for connecting and convening through the pandemic, but nothing like being in the same room with our colleagues. And since our last Government Affairs Forum in 2020 featured Governor Baker, it made sense that we kick off Government Affairs Forums again this year with the Governor as well. Governor Baker, as we know, has announced he will not seek re-election for a third term, so this will be his final address to the Chamber's Government Affairs Forum, and we look forward to his reflections and his thoughts on finishing strong. As I've thought about this morning's breakfast and the past 2 years in particular, I've really thought about the paths that other state leaders and governors have followed during the pandemic. And Governor Baker, on behalf of the Chamber and the business community, we're thankful and very fortunate that we had you leading us in the Commonwealth over the past 2 years. And I also want to thank you for making time today and over the past 8 years each year, taking the time to participate in this event. In addition to the networking, connecting, hearing from people like the governor, one opportunity that I've missed is not being able to have the chance in person to express gratitude to the members of the governor's team, and I feel it's especially important that we pause to say thank you to this group of people who have stepped up in service to the Commonwealth over the past 8 years. As a person who's been there, I know that public service is an honor and a privilege. It's rewarding and disappointing, and it can be a sacrifice and comes with far less appreciation than it deserves. So on behalf of the business community, I'd like you to join me in recognizing a few people from the governor's staff who have joined us today, starting with Chief of Staff to Governor Baker, Kristen Lepore. Kristen, thank you for all you've done for the past 8 years. And Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Kathleen Theoharides. Kathleen. Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development, and a 2022 Pinnacle honoree, Rosalind Acosta. And Secretary of Transportation and CEO, MassDOT, Jamie Tesler. Jamie. And let's give a round of applause to several secretaries who could not be with us this morning, Secretaries Pizer, Reedy, Heffernan, Wood, and Keneally. Please join me in thanking those secretaries. And of course, I'd be remiss if I did not thank and mention the governor's partner, Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, who did succeed in visiting every city and town in the Commonwealth over the past 8 years. I also want to recognize a few special guests today. We have the CEO of Massport, Lisa Whalen. Lisa. Former Governor, Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld. The former Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, Robert DeLeo. And his former chairman of Ways and Means, Brian Dempsey. Former Senator Paul White is here. Paul. And we have a couple of other former CEOs of Massport. Joining us is Tom Glenn, former CEO of Massport. And I know former CEO Steve Taco is here as well, so we could get a lot of things done at Massport today, Governor. And the former chair of the MBTA Control Board, who did a great job over 6 years, Joe Aiello. I know she signed up. I don't see former state senator and state representative and Chamber Executive Committee member Linda Dorsina-Forey. Is Linda here? No? Okay. And my partner in running the Chamber, please give a warm welcome to Chamber Board Chair Micho Spring. So, a couple of commercial messages, a few upcoming events. On March 29th, we will have a Women's Network breakfast featuring Karen Kaplan, Chair and CEO of Hill Holiday and a member of the Chamber's Executive Committee. In addition to this Government Affairs Forum, another big series of events is a Women's Network breakfast, and many women professionals attend, and guys that are smart enough to show up go to those events too. So on March 29th, please put on your calendar a discussion with Karen Kaplan. On April 13th, we'll host a special event featuring General Stan McChrystal, best known for his command of the Joint Special Operations Command in the mid-2000s and credited with the capture of Saddam Hussein in 2003. And lastly, the big Chamber event is back. On May 17th, we will host our 2022 annual meeting, and we have a great lineup of distinguished Bostonians this year. As you know, each year at the Chamber annual event, we induct people into the Academy of Distinguished Bostonians. This year's inductees are Dr. Paula Johnson of Wellesley College, Dr. Vanessa Calderon Rosado of IBA, Dr. Tom Glenn of the Harvard Kennedy School and formerly of Massport. And in recognition of his 8 years of service to the Commonwealth of Governor, our special guest today, Charlie Baker. So please join us on May 17th. You can find out more about those events and all Chamber events at bostonchamber.com. We're almost ready for Governor Baker, but two important thank yous. Thank you to our friends at Comcast who helped bring our government affairs programs to a wider audience, including a live stream on NBC10boston.com this morning. Hello to our viewers online. And finally, I want to welcome back and thank our long-standing Government Affairs Forum sponsor, Bank of America. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Brian Grip, Head of State Government Affairs, Government Relations at Bank of America, to introduce Governor Baker.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Chamber, our Bank of America State President, Mihal Chamberlain, and all of our teammates that call the Commonwealth home, I'm honored to introduce today's guest speaker, Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker. Since taking office in early 2015, Governor Baker has been committed to making Massachusetts a place where everyone can live, work, and raise a family. His administration has worked to close two budget gaps worth more than $2 billion without raising taxes, while bolstering local aid for our schools and communities, investing in a more reliable public transportation system, and prioritizing funds to fight the opioid and heroin epidemic. Ensuring Massachusetts continues to be a national leader in education, Governor Baker has invested over $4.6 billion in Chapter 70 education funding, the highest level of local education aid in state history. And most recently, Governor Baker and his administration led our state through an unprecedented pandemic and time of social reckoning. Prior to his election, Governor Baker was a highly successful leader of a complex business and government organizations, serving as cabinet secretary to both Governor William Weld and Paul Cellucci, and leading Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare as CEO. It has been a privilege to have Governor Baker here with us each year of his tenure, and we're looking forward to hearing from him this morning. And he's a good guy, really good guy. Please join me in welcoming to stage Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker.
So, please, you can sit. Sit, please. So thanks very much for that in-person introduction at this in-person event. You know, Jim, I was thinking about this. I actually did do this event last year. I just did it virtually, sitting at my desk in the ceremonial office in the State House, and I did remember and reflect a bit on the last time I had done this event in person, which of course had been in March of 2020, right before sort of everything changed. And I think in some ways for all of us, there are elements of the past 2 years that will, for all intents and purposes, define a lot of things about how we all live and think about work, life, family, community, and all the rest as we go forward. I will say this, I think the one message I would deliver to all of you about that has been the sort of front row seat that we and our administration have had to the people of Massachusetts over the course of this very difficult past 2 years. There used to be a governor's call. I can't remember if it was Thursday or Tuesday night, but it was every week. And it started at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, because that meant it was 5 o'clock on the West Coast. And sometimes there were 5 governors on it, sometimes there were 20, sometimes there were more. And it was really more like a therapy session. It didn't have an organized structure to it, but it just gave all of us a chance to talk about and listen to one another about whatever was on our minds and what problems we were trying to solve and how we were trying to work our way through these really unusual and uncharted waters. And I would hang up the phone at the end of those calls, and sometimes they literally lasted 2 or 3 hours. And I would either walk into the kitchen, where my wife Lauren would be, or I'd go upstairs and join her and go into bed. And I would say, you know, as I listen to the way my colleagues talk about the problems and the issues and the challenges that they're facing with the pandemic, I'm really glad that I'm actually the governor here in Massachusetts, because the message that came back in many cases from these calls, remember this was a therapy session, was people talking about how difficult it was in many cases to get certain kinds of things done that, while complicated here, were not made more difficult by the people that we were asking to sort of step up and do stuff. We never had any trouble getting anybody to volunteer to do anything during the course of this, nothing. We never had trouble getting people to at least try to follow the rules, whatever they were, whether they liked them or not. We didn't have some of the problems that many of my colleagues had in just managing to maintain the peace in public. And you sort of go down this list, and I would listen to these calls, and there's always that whole thing about the other person's grass is always greener. Well, I would get off those calls, and I would think to myself, wow, I am really lucky that I'm here in the Commonwealth, where people are trying to be kind to each other, trying to be productive, trying to find a way to support folks in their community, and trying to find a way to keep their head above it all as they work their way through this very difficult and challenging time. And that, in many ways, for me, is always going to be the most lasting and significant part of the pandemic, which is how well, whatever you thought of any of the decisions we and others made, the people of Massachusetts performed under extreme circumstances over an extended period of time. And I don't think that gets said enough. I think in many cases the focus is usually on the people who are on the receiving end of the TVs, when in fact what it really ought to be on are the people on the other end of the TVs, who time and time again made it work in their own communities in one way or another. And that's about all the reflection you're going to get out of me today, Jim, because we still have a lot of stuff we need to get done between now and the end of our term. And that's what I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time talking about. Governor Weld will be pleased to know that we do have a tax cut proposal before the legislature. And it includes a wide number of pieces to it. There's tax relief there for renters who obviously are dealing with really significant increases in their housing costs under the current economic climate we're in. There's tax relief in there for low-income people here in the Commonwealth. Massachusetts has some of the highest low-income people who pay taxes in the Commonwealth in the country. And at a minimum, what we ought to be doing here is at least adopting the no-tax status as it exists under federal law, which would mean that some of the lowest income earning taxpayers of the Commonwealth would become non-taxpayers, which in many respects, given all the challenges and issues many of those folks face, would be more money in their pocket and good news to them. There's also a proposal there to significantly increase the so-called circuit breaker on property taxes for our older residents, many of whom, as everybody knows, have suffered more than most through the course of this whole pandemic. There is also a proposal to significantly improve the competitive position of our estate tax. There aren't that many states that have estate taxes to begin with. Pretty much nobody has an estate tax that's as aggressive as the estate tax here in the Commonwealth. Even Oregon, which is the only other state that has an estate tax that starts at $1 million, their estate tax actually starts at $1 million. Our tax taxes you on everything up to $1 million once you hit the $1 million mark. This is an enormous disincentive for people as they age to stay here in the Commonwealth of Mass. And the beauty of this one is there are plenty of Democrats as well as Republicans who think it's time that we made our estate tax just a little bit more competitive. And the final one on this list is a cut in our short-term capital gains tax. Our capital gains tax on a short-term basis is 12%. That's a staggering number relative to what you see on short-term capital gains taxes in virtually every other state in the country. And because so much of what people invest in these days are bundled funds, mutual funds of one kind or another, as those mutual funds buy and sell stocks over the course of the year, that lands on the state income tax of a lot of people who are moderate income earners who just happen to be in a mutual fund or some other savings vehicle that's not an IRA, that's not a Roth, that's not tax protected. And we're taxing them at 12% of what they earn on that. And again, it just puts us in an enormously competitive disadvantage. And at a point in time when, if people have learned anything over the past 2 years, one of the biggest things they've learned when it comes to work and where they live, it's that those two things no longer have to be directly related to one another. And we should all take that very seriously as we think about our competitive position going forward. We've had a hearing before the legislature on this stuff. We've been talking to both the House and the Senate about it. There does seem to be a fair amount of interest in the legislature in doing something with respect to tax policy, which we think is great. And part of the reason for that, frankly, is our economy, despite all of the disruption and everything else that's gone on over the course of the past 2 years, has actually performed from a tax point of view exceedingly well. I mean, we've been basically reporting a surplus over expectations every month now for practically 2 years. And the good news is part of that's because we did a really good job working with our colleagues in the legislature. Huge shout out to the tag team of DeLeo and Dempsey. In the old days, I would never have called them anything other than Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chairman, but given their new gigs, I can get a little less formal. Those folks were terrific allies in getting the state's fiscal house in order. And having your fiscal house in order when something really awful happens, like a pandemic, is a really good thing because you have flexibility and the ability to adapt and resources to invest. And And our economy, as I said, has dramatically overperformed relative to expectations, and we think it's important that we give some of that back to the people who made that all possible. We will also be doing some work on some unusual approaches to supporting employers and those people who are looking to get back to work. We've had a fairly significant bounce back in our employment situation over the course of the past 2 years. We have one of the highest labor force participation rates in the country. And that's a really nerdy term, but the bottom line is about 65, our labor force participation rate's about 65, 66% of those eligible to actually be in the labor force. That's 4 or 5 points higher than the national average. And while we lost about 700,000 jobs during the peak of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, we've gotten back about 580,000 of those jobs that we lost. And we currently have about 250,000 open positions here in Massachusetts, and about 180,000 people, plus or minus, who are looking for work, which gives us an unemployment rate of about 4.8%, which is a little bit above the national average. But the big point here is our labor force participation rate remains extremely high. People here in Massachusetts are either working or looking to work. And one of the things we're going to try to do is provide support to both those who are looking for work and those who are looking for workers as we go forward. We'll have more to say about that later this week. But there are tremendous opportunities for us to help get that final group of folks who currently aren't working back to work, and we think it's really important that that happen, and that happen as quickly as possible. With respect to some of the other elements of the sort of legislative agenda we've got carved out for ourselves, I'll talk about a few. One of the big ones in my mind has to do with healthcare. In 2019, before all the stuff that happened after that occurred, we filed legislation that basically would require, and I'm not a big mandate guy, but there's no other way to get from here to there given federal policy, that would have required employers and insurers to invest more heavily in primary care and behavioral health care. And the reason we did that was, first of all, and this is a little nerdy, all the payment platforms in this country operate off the Medicare fee schedule. We don't have a single payer system in the US, but we absolutely have a payment system that's built on one payer, and it's called Medicare. So every single contract that gets negotiated between every payer and every provider gets converted into whatever that Medicare payment model looks like. So the way people keep score is they basically say, what am I getting paid as a percent of Medicare? Now, the problem with that is that Medicare does not value, never has since the 1960s, primary care, behavioral health care, geriatric care, ironically, and addiction services. What it values is technology, which is not a bad thing, but the bottom line is part of the reason why we have such terrible shortages in behavioral health care, addiction, geriatrics, and primary care at the time we need them most is because they aren't valued by the Medicare fee schedule, and the Medicare fee schedule drives all fee schedules in the United States of America. Now, in the 1960s, when that thing was developed, that may have been the right way to go. But with the advent of chronic illness and so many of the other issues that have changed with respect to the nature of illness generally, the complexity associated with people who typically, in many cases, are dealing with more than one illness at any particular time, that lack of investment, that lack of support for, that lack of appreciation for the importance of addiction services, behavioral health, geriatrics, and primary care basically means we don't have enough of any of those people anywhere in the healthcare system. And that was true in 2019, before the pandemic. It is way more true now. In fact, I would argue that the behavioral health challenges we face, and I'm talking kids, young adults, everybody, are more profound coming out of this pandemic than almost anything else. The sense of isolation, the sense of loss, the disruption, the anxiety, the lack of togetherness, this kind of physicality matters. And especially for a lot of young people, it's been a really long 2 years. And guess what? The other thing Medicare doesn't really like or believe in or support very much, which won't come as a surprise, pediatrics. Now, this is a nerdy, complicated bill, and I'll be the first to admit it. But if you want to do something as a community about the lack of investment in behavioral health care, primary care, and addiction, you will support this legislation because it is the only way we're going to get from where we are to where we need to go. And I'm going to fight like mad to make it happen. And I absolutely know that if we still had DeLeo and his sidekick over there in the House, all we'd be worrying about is the Senate. And if we still had Paul White, I guess this is what happens when you turn 65, you get old. I'll try very hard not to tell stories about when I was young. The second big piece we have up there is about a $9.7 billion transportation bond bill, which has a name. It's called Mass Track, because transportation bond bill doesn't sound very interesting. Mass Track is Massachusetts Transportation Resilience and Climate Bill. And the reason we're calling it Mass Track is because there's a bunch of stuff in there that's related to something other than just traditional infrastructure. There's a lot of resource in there on the federal side and ultimately on the state side as well to invest in clean water, environmental infrastructure, resiliency, charging stations, and a whole bunch of things that are part of what we would think of as the next act and the next generation in environmental policy and environmental infrastructure, along with the money that's in there for public transportation, roads and bridges, and everything else. There's tremendous opportunity here to do work on many of the bridges around the Commonwealth that desperately need to be repaired. There's a ton of money in there for us to continue to invest in electrifying our bus fleet. And I will say one thing about this, one thing only. You can't buy and maintain electric buses if you don't build electric bus maintenance facilities. We don't have a lot of electric bus maintenance facilities. We're just in the process of putting together what I would describe as sort of the next generation on that, and are in the process of building those right now. Jamie Tessler will be pleased to hear me say, and I hope he passes along to General Manager Steve Poftak, that I said you can't have electric buses if you don't have electric bus maintenance facilities. Nobody wants an electric bus maintenance facility in their yard or in their neighborhood or anywhere near them, but you gotta have them if you actually want to maintain an electric bus fleet. We are in the process of building out several of them. There will probably be one coming to a neighborhood near you soon, and I really hope when that happens, you'll be there to do the right thing. We are also going to continue to invest in what I would describe as sort of next generation vehicles for much of our fleet. And we don't talk much about this, but we've invested somewhere in the vicinity of $3 to $3.5 billion in our public transportation assets on stuff no one ever sees or cares about. And I said when we took office, and I said at this breakfast in like 2015, that we were going to spend a lot of money on public transportation on stuff we'd never get credit for, and that we had thought that was the right thing to do. And we did that, and guess what? We didn't get any credit for it. So all that money we've spent on signals and switches and tracks and electronics and power systems, all of which were 40, 50, and 60 years old when we took office and are fundamental to the modernization and the future of public transportation, we got nothing for it. Nothing. You open up a new Green Line station somewhere and everybody shows up at the media and it's brass bands and bugles and which is not to say that wasn't a great project, and I'm not complaining. And a ton of people did a lot of great work to make that Green Line extension happen. But there's two big pieces to public transportation. One is where it goes, and the second is how it gets there. And everybody likes to talk about the where it goes part. What people really don't like to talk very much about, because it's boring and it's complicated and it's difficult, it's the how it gets there part. And as we all move forward as a Commonwealth, I really do hope we continue to invest in the how it gets there part, because that in many respects has a lot to do with building public credibility around the where it goes part. There's tremendous opportunity associated with this bill. I love the fact that it was called the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And I think it gives us as a Commonwealth tremendous opportunities to do many great things going forward. The one other piece of it that's kind of an interesting bank shot is we've been spending the past 5 or 6 years talking to the Army Corps of Engineers about the Cape Cod bridges, which, as everybody knows, have been around for a really long time and are a constant state of either repair or disrepair, depending upon how you want to frame it. And the reason we've been talking to them is those are their bridges, but we are the ones who ultimately own the consequences of those bridges. They are constantly under repair. They're probably beyond their appropriate shelf life. And what we've been doing for the past few years is trying to negotiate a way out of all this, the stasis that we've had in place for quite a while with the feds on this. And we eventually signed a couple of MOUs that basically headed us down this road of the feds would build 2 new bridges, since the canal, which they wanted, is the reason we have the bridges in the first place. And we would take care of building all the connective tissue on either side of the canal and pay for that. And then they would deed the bridges over to us, and we would maintain and manage them going forward. And the good news there is, after 3 or 4 years worth of work between the Army Corps and the Federal Department of Transportation and Federal Highway and our administration, we had the whole template built. And then the bipartisan infrastructure bill comes along, and while the bridges themselves did not get quote-unquote funded, earmarked in that legislation, there's a lot of competitive money that's available under that bill, and our senators and our administration worked together and managed to get the Army Corps to agree that they would do something very unusual, which is they would bid competitively as the Army Corps of Engineers to Federal Highway on replacing those bridges. So we are now in the process of working with the Army Corps to write a competitive bid on those bridges that will go to the other side of the federal government, right down the street, and hopefully get approved, and then we will all get to work building 2 new bridges over the Cape Cod Canal, and all of the connective tissue that will need to be in place on either side, so that hopefully, by the time you get out 4 or 5 years from now, we'll actually have something other than bridges that are way past their shelf life, that will be bigger, wider, more modern, better, serving all those people who have to go back and forth over those bridges every day. That one, to me, is sort of another interesting example of, if we hadn't spent 5 years laying all the groundwork for this, I'm not quite sure what would have happened when the bipartisan infrastructure bill finally came along. There's a little bit of luck in that, but there was a ton of planning and preparation as well. And that project, for many people, will make a really big difference. The one other thing I do want to mention, we also filed sort of a next generation offshore wind bill. You should all take credit for the fact that Massachusetts basically created, kicked off, catalyzed the deepwater offshore wind industry in the United States. The work we did with our colleagues in the legislature on the first deepwater offshore wind procurement came in at such a low price, shocking everybody, that all of a sudden everybody up and down the East Coast suddenly wanted to get into the offshore wind business. And so instead of just having one project in Massachusetts, there are now literally dozens and dozens of projects. And every time the federal government at this point puts any of its waters, federal waters off the coast, out to auction, they get tons of bids on them from offshore wind developers all over the world. And the reason why is people now view it as a viable, not just good thing to do from a green point of view, which it is, but a good thing to do from an economic development and a competitive position point of view as well. And we have several procurements that are currently in the process of being built and developed, several more that will probably be coming. But one of the things that's in the bill that we filed, which is, in my opinion, a really important piece of the future of energy, electricity, and environmental justice and climate, is a $750 million energy innovation fund. And the reason for that fund is there are so many interesting ideas that people have about how to deliver a cleaner and greener economy, and they are going to need a bit of a lift from us to get from where they are to where they need to go. You can think of the analogy, if you're looking for one, would probably be the Life Science Center, which has had a profound impact, especially on the training and education of scientists and other people who work in the life science space here in Massachusetts. But I'll give you a really simple example of why this matters. There's a company up in Andover called 6K. I'm sure that Secretary Theo Herides is shocked that I would bring this one up. 6K stands for the temperature on the sun, 6,000 degrees, okay? They basically use heat to pulverize old scrap, old batteries, car parts, any sort of metal, and by pulverizing these things, break them down into their original core elements. Now, why would you do that? Because they then can create cobalt and other key materials associated with building what? Batteries, electric vehicle batteries. And what they are trying to do is to take back one of the most fundamental elements of the future of electric vehicles, which is the ability to build batteries from primarily China, and getting it out of the process of having only one way of doing this, which is digging it out of the ground, which comes with enormous environmental consequences. So if these guys can actually pull this off, and basically people pay them to take their scrap, so that's recycling to begin with. They pulverize it, they create these precious metals that we need to build batteries, and then they take them and they use them as core elements to build batteries. Pretty cool idea, pretty cool company. There's a lot, started at MIT, why is it always MIT? Started by some guy at MIT, 10 years ago, who's basically been crawling along, and now he's got a business. And if we really want to accelerate this whole next act in energy, broadly defined, we're going to need a whole bunch of those kinds of companies. And many of the people who are thinking big thoughts about this stuff are here. And if we want to keep them here and grow them here, we should have a fund like that that's available to support them. So I would ask you to seriously consider supporting that as this process moves through the legislature. One final thing, and then I'll stop because I know Jim has lots of questions he wants to ask me that I'll do my very best not to answer. We are going through an enormous transformation in how people think about work. And I want to thank the folks at McKinsey for the work they did with us on our future of work study. I do think the future of work is going to be different. I think where they live, how they live, where they work, how they work, those things are all going to be different. I think the key question is how different. No one really knows the answer to that one. But it's hard for me to believe that we won't live in a world where there is a lot more latitude around where you work than we've ever seen before. And I think that's going to be more true for the next generation than it probably is for mine. I think about my own kids. You know, they all work really hard, and they live in 3 different states, and they do spend some portion of their time working remotely, and I don't think they could ever imagine not doing that. Because they are just going to grow up in a world in which this is sort of de rigueur. It's part of the way you think about how you work. And I think that has real implications for how states compete with each other, how you organize your downtowns, what it means with respect to housing policy, and a whole bunch of other things. And the hard part here is no one knows exactly what the answer is going to be. But my final comment on this would be, I think we should all assume it won't be the way it was, and we therefore need to think real hard about how we make investments in our downtowns and in other areas for which the world will change. And I'll leave you with this. We filed, based on that Future of Work report, we filed a $250 million proposal to work with downtowns around reimagining and reconsidering how their downtowns operate, how much of it's residential, how much of it's office, how much of it is bikeable, how much of it's walkable. What are you going to do to sort of get people in and out of those areas, and how are you going to think about them as place-making activities? That's what we got. Nothing. The Commonwealth has billions of dollars in federal funds that are available to deal with the consequences of the pandemic. We will file again shortly significant resources for placemaking, reimagination, and creativity around downtowns. And I would ask this organization and every chamber and every other organization to recognize and understand that the future of downtowns is going to be different, whether we like it or not, than it was before, and that we need to start the process of reimagining the placemaking of downtowns so that they can thrive and be successful in what will be a slightly different world in many cases, and a significantly different world in some cases than the one we all had before the pandemic. It's very nice to see you all. I hope I see you all a lot before the end of my term. Thank you. That was probably a little longer than I was supposed to talk for. Is that right? Yeah, sure, whatever.
So, Governor, since you spoke so long, we're going to be here for a while with questions.
I got no place to go.
You know, I'll start with one.
You let those people have. I have nothing to do. Those people there, they have a lot to do.
Yeah.
So.
No, we'll get out of here. But you know, you framed a lot of your comments about tax cuts and offshore wind, healthcare, transportation, and you used the word several times in the context of competitiveness. As you think about the Commonwealth and our competitiveness going forward, what do you see in the category of tailwinds and headwinds?
I think the biggest headwind is our cost of housing. That is the thing that my children in particular have pointed out to me, since 2 or 3 of them don't live here anymore. The thing about this, Amazon, when they were looking for their second corporate headquarters, we made it to sort of the final 5 states, and they came and did a site visit here, and when they left, and Jay Ash will vouch for me on this because he was the Economic Affairs Secretary at the time, when they left they said, your housing's way too expensive, your development process is ridiculous, and we do not believe you are going to have the ability to create the kind of housing that we're going to need for our workforce. And then they picked New York City, which failed because New York, for some reason, didn't want them. And then they picked metropolitan Washington, D.C., Okay? Now, if we aren't good enough compared to those two places with respect to the cost of housing and the ability to develop it, my oh my. Now, we did get housing choice passed with the support of many of the folks in this room, and big shout out to, well, just you, Mr. Speaker, because by then the chairman was gone, which will make it possible for communities to develop housing here in Massachusetts with a far more traditional process than they could before. But we have tremendous challenges with the cost of housing for everybody, and we filed significant resources as part of what to use that federal money for around housing, and we got some of it back from the legislature, but nowhere near what we need. And this was a big focus of the McKinsey report as well, which basically said our housing costs are going to be a significant challenge for us to be competitive as we go forward. So, number one, and we'll file more because we know we need to spend more on housing. We have a ton of work we need to do on housing. I think that's in many ways our biggest headwind. I think our biggest tailwind is we're still wicked smart in a world where being wicked smart really matters. And whether you're talking about the life science industry where, what are the estimates at this point? They're huge. I mean, with respect to how much lab capacity people are planning to build over the next 5 to 10 years. And I do believe in the energy space. There are a lot of really smart people around this Commonwealth working on a whole variety of solutions to create a cleaner, greener energy environment, which is why that innovation fund is so interesting to us. And I do think the just incredible constellation of colleges and universities we have is always going to make us a player. The big challenge we've got is to figure out how to make sure that all the work we're doing in career technical training and vocational technical and education is all designed to actually land people with skills in places where they can get jobs. And one of the things you'll see a lot from us before we leave office is a desire to dramatically open the aperture around what we call an apprenticeship. Because we think we should have apprenticeships in basically everything. And we think that would make a big difference with respect to our ability to provide people, not just the high-end folks, but all the other folks who are going to be necessary to make some of these really important industries here in Massachusetts work.
Thank you, Governor. And I've been waiting 2 years to hear Paul Paravano's question in a government affairs forum. So, Paul, what do you have for the governor?
Governor Baker, pleasure to have you here. My colleagues and I want to thank you for the brilliant way that you've talked up universities, not just one or two, but all universities in the Commonwealth. I also want to say that you exemplify open-minded and fair and balanced thinking about issues. I'm reminded of the story that you and then Governor Raimondo contributed to each other's campaigns. I also know that you grew up in a house. I also know that you grew up in a house where your parents voted quite differently. And you said at the beginning this morning that you were done reflecting. Can you tell us one or two things that you might want to say to the next governor?
Paul. It's Paul.
So Rooney really put me on the hook there because he knows how much I like Paul. And I would say the following, Paul. The first piece I would say is, and this is easier said than done, is, how many of you used to write letters, angry letters to people, and then you'd read them and you'd put them in a drawer and you'd wait a couple of days and then decide whether or not to send them, and more often than not end up throwing them away? I used to do that a lot. I still do it with emails and text messages and all the rest. The biggest thing I would say is don't let the heat of the moment get in the way of your longer-term objectives. Democracy's messy. The process doesn't always work the way you want it to, but you will never get there or get to where you're going if you lash out every time you don't get what you want. And in this day and age especially, with all the social media stuff and everything else, there's far more anger than appreciation in most public dialogue and certainly in most political conversations. But one of the things I take a lot of satisfaction in is most people think our administration's tried pretty hard to stick to the issues and to not make, the whole thing into almost a caricature of what public life and politics is supposed to be about. So that would be number one. And I think number two would be to recognize and understand that the people of the Commonwealth are by far its greatest asset. And the things that we can do to help them be successful wherever they live in Massachusetts, and to recognize and understand that different parts of Massachusetts are driven by different things, is sort of the biggest and best part of why this state succeeds. And the third thing, you only asked for two, I'll give you three. This is a really humbling job, and if you don't understand that and you don't appreciate that day in and day out, more often than not, you are going to be surprised by your own inadequacies. You probably ought to get into another line of work. This work, if you're actually paying attention, is incredibly rewarding and satisfying when you succeed. But it will challenge you in ways that go way beyond what you could have ever possibly imagined. And maybe that's just me responding to 2 years of trying to manage through a pandemic. But I am constantly saying to myself, I wish I was a hell of a lot better at A, B, or C than I actually am. And that's because the job, just by definition, puts you in a position where you're constantly expected to get things done that just on paper look not quite doable. And you should just accept that and recognize that your goal is to continue to try to move the thing as hard and as far as you possibly can in the right direction, and to recognize that getting there will never be a straight line. It's always going to require a trip through the House, and a trip through Ways and Means, and a trip through the Senate, and a trip through here, and a trip through there. And then finally, if you stick with it, and you do recognize that it's a team sport, and you do get the fact that you're a player in a much bigger room full of participants, you will get things done. You'll make some amazing friendships and relationships, and you'll get to go to bed at night knowing that you tried your absolute best to make this place a little better than it was when you found it.
Governor Baker will have many opportunities to say thank you for your service and performance as our governor, but for today, to continue your sports analogy, if you're in the fourth quarter of your administration, thank you for demonstrating today that you intend to perform in the fourth quarter with the same energy and enthusiasm that you started the game. Thank you, Governor Baker.